In 2016, SAGES, the Society of American Gastrointestinal and Endoscopic Surgeons, is a vibrant surgical society. With over 6,000 members, SAGES has become a force in American and international surgery with its cutting-edge annual scientific meetings and educational offerings. But SAGES was not born fully formed. This is a story of attraction to a new concept, the germ of an idea, and the gestation of that idea until it came to fruition. It is a story of two surgeons, united by a common consuming interest, who gathered around them a steadfast group of skilled, but perhaps renegade surgeons, ready to stand up for their beliefs.
There was a need for surgeons with common interests in gastrointestinal endoscopy to have a means to communicate. And an organization comprised of surgeon endoscopists would have provided that opportunity.
Surgeons are requested and in fact compelled by the American Board of Surgery to have included in the present training of residents exposure to and expertise in performing flexible fiber optic endoscopy of all sorts.
I present this paper with a bit of trepidation and expect a good deal of discussion. It's some relatively new material, and I look forward to hearing your comments. So may I have the first slides, please?
How did SAGES begin? It was not neat and orderly. It involved technology, inquiring surgeons, and mavericks. Long, long ago, there arose an invention. The flexible endoscope was developed and made available to physicians. Although initial interest was amongst gastroenterologists, several surgeons became captivated by the potential of this new instrument. Unbeknownst to each of them at the time of their initial infatuation, their drive, experience, and accelerating recognition of the potential of this technology was accumulating, years before they even became aware of each other.
To share the beginning of SAGES is a treat of a lifetime. I guess the SAGES story truly begins with the introduction of the flexible fiber optic colonoscope. I became involved with the treatment of rectal cancer with external radiation in 1957. And I then moved into a serious interest in radiation injuries of the intestine. The rigid sigmoidoscope was not an instrument that could be used with any effectiveness in people who had fixed, rigid pelvic structures. So when I saw the flexible fiber optic colonoscope, I knew I had to have it. I was able to convince Olympus to let me have the first production model. That was 1969. And I did it with a major part of my life savings, and my dear wife, Barbara, never knew it until very much later.
Bill Wolf, he started using the colonoscope and made a presentation at Columbia. And one of my mentors, the late Arthur Voorhees, said, "Ken, now there's something for you to get involved with." And he actually gave me some funds to buy what was then the short colonoscope. So I discovered that the radiologists did barium enemas in the morning, and the afternoon while they were reading their films, the rooms were empty. So Marty Max, who was then one of my residents, and I decided we're going to see if we can borrow those rooms.
And I would have to carry this thing through the hospital corridors, up elevators, different elevators. I was removing polyps from patients who were such bad medical risks the surgeons wouldn't operate on them. The healthy patients, if they had a polyp noted on a barium enema study, they had a laparotomy and a colotomy and a polypectomy. But the very, very bad medical risks were referred to me.
So that when the ASGE was in formation, I was right there. I remember when they had meetings of the entire ASGE. We sat around a long table in one room. So I started out early with that group.
At the time, in the early 70s, I was a young faculty member at the University of Michigan. I had finished my training in the late 60s and then stayed on the faculty and became fascinated immediately in probably 1970, 71 by flexible endoscopy. I used to carry the scopes back and forth between the VA hospital where my office was and the university hospital. Two things were happening. The gastroenterologists became full-time at the university, as they did many places, and were essentially cornering the market on flexible endoscopy. I had the opportunity in 1974 for a completely different reason to become what they called a visiting professor in Niigata, Japan. There was a man named Ogoshi who was a whiz with the flexible endoscope.
Well, I joined Cedars of Lebanon in 1970, and my main interest was endoscopic surgery in general. In Australia, I witnessed a lecture of a Japanese surgeon who showed one of the first colonoscopy results. I was very interested. When I came here to the States, I thought this is a very important aspect to establish a teaching center. Therefore, we built a small miniature endo camera in 1962. It was, of course, black and white. It wasn't accepted, but we know that this is the future way to go.
I was a resident in surgery at University Hospitals in Cleveland, and I had the opportunity to have an elective in my 4th year of residency, 4 out of 5. And it was supposed to be for 3 months, and I actually thought, well, I'm tired. I'm working so hard. I'm going to take an elective in something easy so I don't have a lot of night call. And so I signed up to do flexible endoscopy because I saw what they were doing. It was easy. The gastroenterologists were just learning about it. And I signed up to do it with the gastroenterologists. And a week before I was supposed to go, I called them. And I said, what time and where should I show up? And they said, we made a mistake. We don't want to train any surgeons to do this. And then I caught my interest. I said, well, now I really want to learn how to do it. Someone arranged for me to train with a very superb private practice gastroenterologist in Canton, Ohio. I drove an hour and a half each way every day and spent 6 months with him. I was able to write papers at that time about injecting India ink into the site of a suspicious polyp, and we actually followed the patients to surgery and found that there was a black mark on the serosa. That became important only later in the laparoscopic years. And I was told when I joined the staff at the university that as a surgeon I wouldn't be able to be allowed to use the instruments in the GI unit. And my chairman said, I would love to let you do cases, but we can't afford a scope. So my mother-in-law went out and bought me a scope. And I thought that to have a complete picture of all this, I should learn this field of peritoneoscopy or celioscopy. There was this weird guy who had come from Australia to Los Angeles and who spoke with a thick accent, and he said, it is amazing to me that surgeons have never picked up this thing. So I called George Bursey. What scope shall I buy? Because I have someone who's going to give me the money, a grant. And he told me you should buy a 7mm, 28-degree Storz laparoscope.
My experience in endoscopy actually started when I was a resident. I'd had the opportunity of going to London in 1972, and I worked at St. Mark's Hospital. I was a resident in the laboratory. And I got the opportunity to work with John Leonard Jones and Chris Williams. Chris Williams was a young man, he was a gastroenterologist, and we both learned colonoscopy together. So when I got back to Yale, where I was doing my residency, I was the only person at Yale who knew how to do colonoscopy. And I was a third-year resident.
Early adoption by surgeons was not encouraged, either by gastroenterologists or, surprisingly, by other organized surgical societies. There came a point, after formal approaches were rebuffed, that the enthusiasts found a way to share their ideas and experience, and Ken and Gerry were the lightning rods for this.
In 1977, Charles Lightdale Memorial Hospital, now at Columbia, Charles Lightdale and I put on a program on a day in the colon, it was called, colonoscopy, teaching colonoscopy. And for that, we were chastised overwhelmingly by the establishment ASGE members.
The response was overwhelming, and we had standing room only, and I was being bothered all day, every day, by people who wanted to come but couldn't get there. We had two major players. One was Alejandro Castro and John Dixon. John Dixon was a surgeon, endoscopist, and the two of them wrote very strong letters proposing that we have a surgical endoscopic society. Now, that was pretty forceful, that we didn't have a critical mass at that time. So we sort of put it on hold. I offered an abstract for the ASGE meeting in 1979, May 1979 in New Orleans, and the abstract was selected. There was a large number of gastroenterologists who wanted to kill this instrument. And they wanted to kill it for two reasons. They thought it would be an entry level for surgeons to do colonoscopy, and secondly, that it might interfere with their colonoscopy, quote, business. But as I was standing there, it occurred to me that this was the moment. Less than 4 weeks later, the American Society of Colorectal Surgeons met, arranged a meeting with mostly Gene Salvati's former residents. There might have been 25 or 30 people in the room, and I proposed that we start a surgical endoscopic society, and they were most enthusiastic.
And there were differing opinions. Remember, we're talking about people like the late Steve Hedberg, John Collar, and several others, Tom Dent. And there were some differing opinions. Perhaps we should be members, perhaps we should be part of the SSAT. We would work certainly in parallel with ASGE, but not necessarily be an independent organization. There was a lot of discussion about that.
And that we would have to have representation from all specialty interests. To the credit of the colorectal surgeons, when I asked half of them to step aside, they were willing to do that, and we owe them a debt of gratitude. Were they being deprived of use of the endoscopy suites? They were being bargained with. If you don't do colonoscopy, I'll send you my surgery. So the guys that were doing endoscopy were being punished.
The surgeons were a challenge, the GI guys were a challenge, and there were lots of politics involved. But these guys were actually laying their careers on the line. I realized very soon because many people, many surgeons who were doing flexible endoscopy were at risk of not getting any referrals. And that, I thought that was very courageous that they actually were willing to do that.
Some, however, voiced concerns regarding the establishment of a new society.
So when I first heard about SAGES and that Gerry had called a group together to discuss it, I wasn't exactly sure that it was a good idea or that I should participate, that it might compromise my relationship with ASGE, which was very new at that time. Because where I learned what SAGES would be is when I listened to the papers that were presented at the SAGES meeting. And I can still remember one by a man named George Gowan. And George presented a paper about the use of flexible endoscopy to either treat or ameliorate small bowel obstruction. And I said, a gastroenterologist would never present that. He's not interested in small bowel obstruction. It's something the surgeons do. I said, wow.
I politicked, and I think a lot of us politicked very hard not to form a separate society. We did not feel it was necessary. We felt that the powers that already existed within surgery, the American College of Surgeons, the Society for Surgery of the Alimentary Tract, and a number of others, would basically back us and keep endoscopy as a diagnostic and therapeutic part of surgery. It was becoming more and more therapeutic, and obviously to many of us, to most of us, it was an advancement in surgery. And so we talked to the SSAT, we talked to the American College of Surgeons, and could not generate much enthusiasm for them to really publicly, they would privately sympathize, but publicly, I know they were afraid of offending the gastroenterologists, and we decided that we really did have to form our own society to protect surgeons' ability to incorporate and maintain endoscopy, flexible endoscopy.
And remember, many of us were already members of SSAT, but it was clear that SSAT was not going to be embracing endoscopy. So we were sort of looked upon as almost outcasts, banding together and having that camaraderie.
SAGES was born in concept. A preliminary meeting was held at Chicago O'Hare in 1980. The founding membership meeting was held in Atlanta, Georgia in 1981. The name and logo were developed.
It was in 1975 that I have the first actual recording, not audio, don't worry, but I made a note of our first conversation was in 1975 about the possible formation of a surgical organization involving endoscopists.
We had a meeting at O'Hare. It was maybe 20 of us, but it was in early 1980. And we crystallized our thoughts and plans and set the stage for the subsequent meeting.
I was the, quotes, first membership chairman even before we were organized. So with his usual ebullience, Dr. Marks would invite you to about this, give you the idea, say yes, and so on. And then I was the one who had to correspond with them.
By the way, along this entire route, Ken and I were on the phone every night, and some of the conversations went to 1 o'clock in the morning or later.
I frequently tell this story about Gerry. He didn't just have an idea, he had a vision. And as an old Indian proverb or story tells it, a vision means that you not only think of the idea, but you think of how you execute it.
We had the February meeting of 1981 at the Peachtree Plaza in Atlanta. Properly trained surgeons had the right and privilege to endoscope their patients. I stood up and said, you know, shall we just abandon this? Shall we quit? And it was the equivalent to hell no. And they were the heroes, the people in that room. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
ACMI really was involved in making the first flexible instruments, including the colonoscope. There was a wonderful man named Bob Quint, who was a representative of ACMI. And as it turned out, he knew a man named Gerry Marks. So one day, I was in my office at the VA, and I got this letter introducing a man to me who was starting an organization. And they were going to have a meeting in Atlanta. I went to the meeting in the Peachtree Plaza, and I heard about this organization. I heard from Gerry Marks, Heron Debkarian, certain other individuals who I knew of as a resident but never met. And so it was exciting for me. There were about maybe 35 people in a fairly small room at the Peachtree Plaza.
Some of us in academia were disinvited from collaborative studies. Here in this region, I was.
A big page of all sorts of combinations, and SAGES ended up winning. What most people didn't tumble to at first, that the logo has in the cecum an S, in the hepatic flexure an A G in the splenic flexure, an E in the sigmoid, and an S in the rectal curve. So I had fun doing that.
The first scientific sessions were held in 1984 at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
It was always a great honor to be invited to be in one of those meetings, and always a very worrisome for us who were giving it that we'd have enough people attending.
Gerry Marks really was the impetus, at least had the enthusiasm and the energy and the charisma to make this kind of happen, to bring us together.
The success of the first meeting in 1984 prompted a realization that this level of input, data, and enthusiasm needed to be managed by someone with equivalent confidence and enthusiasm.
We had a first scientific meeting at the Bellevue Stratford with maybe 40 people, 50 people. But there was a lot of passion. And I invited Barbara Saltzman to see that. And she made the comment that, boy, there was a lot of information being transferred.
We thought we needed more organization, more staffing. And we talked to Gerry about it. And it was Gerry who proposed that Barbara Saltzman at that time be a candidate. And I was president then, Tom Dent was vice president. We interviewed her and we engaged her.
In 1984, my mom was in the hospital and Gerry Marks was her surgeon. And after lots of discussions about her condition, he told me about this wonderful new group and that they were looking for new management. So he suggested that I apply, which I did. And then a few months later, I had a meeting with Ken Forde and Tom Dent in a little tiny room at the Bellevue Stratford where they were holding a meeting. And I found out a little bit more about SAGES and what they were doing and what my very limited role would be in the beginning. But I'm not sure that anyone at that time, besides maybe Gerry and Ken Forde, envisioned that if SAGES stayed with visionary thinking, it could become a powerhouse for patients and a powerhouse in the surgical community. He was a visionary thinker, and Ken was one of the most organized people I've ever met, and a very statesman-like person. In 1984, SAGES was having perhaps a half-day postgraduate course hooked on to other people's symposia. One at Jefferson, I think there was one in Ann Arbor.
The first independent meeting was planned and held in Williamsburg in 1986.
The person who was president that year, the year we had our first one, which was 1986, was Jim Lind, who was an amazing man. And Marty Max worked with him in Virginia. And so they volunteered to be the program chair and coordinator for the first meeting, which was held in Williamsburg, Virginia.
So SAGES was the standard bearer for flexible endoscopy and surgery. The society that said surgeons not only were allowed to do it, but were supposed to do it. And very quickly realized that their lifeblood would be establishing standards of practice and guidelines for surgeons in endoscopy. And that legitimized SAGES.
What we did a lot of, because all of us were very experienced endoscopists by that time, we felt that it was important to set standards. We wrote standards, we wrote guidelines for how you get trained. We ran workshops. Eventually, I can't remember the years, but the American College of Surgeons was happy to have us run initially a workshop on flexible sigmoidoscopy. The instrument manufacturers were thrilled that we were more than willing to join with them to provide education to surgeons.
SAGES' early links with the international community lay the foundation for the subsequent turning point in SAGES' history.
The next milestone, I think, was in 1986 when I proposed that we have a Committee on International Relations.
Those who were involved with the journal from the beginning, surgical endoscopy, in addition to the American guys, Ted Schrock and George and Ken Forde, who was the editor, there was Hans Treudel and a guy named Greudel and Mannheim, lots of Europeans. So the whole idea of surgical endoscopy from the SAGES leadership point, not necessarily official point, was always international.
1989 was a watershed year for the organization. Tell me a little about what happened that year, especially vis-a-vis the annual meeting.
Everyone has a different story for how this happened, but I'll tell you what it looked like from my desk. I was in my office in LA one day when Jacques Parasat called. George and I knew him from the International Biliary Association, and he said to me, I'm not going to get this accent right, Barbara, I have some things that I would like to get on the program and for the meeting. And I said, oh, the program is already set. I think it was the end of January. The program's already set, Jacques, what is it? And he said, I have done the laparoscopic cholecystectomy. And because I'm always sure that the other person is wrong, I said to him, oh, you mean cholecystostomy? And he said, no, it was the cholecystectomy. And I said, you took a gallbladder out through the scope? And he said, yes, this is what I have done. And I said, give me your number, I'll call you back tomorrow. So I called Wayne Schwessinger, and he was a little concerned. He didn't know Jacques, he didn't know if it was real. And the program was set, you know, because of printing, you had to go to bed with the program 2 months before. So I called George, and I said, Jacques says he's done that. And he said, well, that can't wait till next year's program. So his paper wasn't, as some people think, that his paper was rejected in the abstract process. It's just that it came in a different way. So we decided to put him in the exhibit hall.
Well, Jacques Parasat brought that, and I have to say everybody sat there stunned because everybody saw in retrospect how completely logical this was. But for somebody to put it up there on a screen, I mean, even a little choked up thinking about that meeting, that really kicked off the SAGES explosion. That one video.
It's an easy organization. You can not only get inside the leadership, but you get inside the family. People bring their spouses to this meeting and their kids to this meeting, and it started as a close-knit group of people with a vision, and it continued as an enlarging family. And I think that the fact that they keep bringing young people in to do the work and to get the glory has been one of the hallmarks of what has made SAGES the kind of an organization it is in emerging technology and in everything new, and being willing to have the courage to just take on whatever comes down the road.
– 2016 marks the 35th annual scientific meeting. The meeting you see today bears almost no resemblance to the few attendees and exhibitors at that first independent meeting, other than one critical aspect that runs through SAGES: the enthusiasm and desire and focus to improve our skills as surgeons to improve patient outcomes. Whether that requires education, improved skills, access to advanced technology or research funding, SAGES provides that forum amidst a group of like-minded surgeons.